You know that feeling, right? Staring at a screen, or maybe just your to-do list, and feeling like the sheer volume of services you rely on, from your morning coffee app to the complex systems that keep your business running, is just, well, it's overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
How do you even begin to understand, let alone manage, that sprawling landscape of modern service delivery, all the moving parts?
It's a huge challenge, isn't it? Sort of the central challenge of our connected world. And information overload. It's not just about news feeds anymore.
Yeah.
It's about the complexity baked into the services we depend on every single day. And, crucially, how to make sure they're delivered effectively, reliably.
Absolutely. And that underlying complexity is exactly why we're doing this deep dive. Welcome. Today we're tackling a specific, really important document that offers a kind of roadmap through all that complexity.
Yeah. Which one?
It's ISO 2000 2.201.E. Now, okay, don't let the numbers and letters scare you off.
Easy to do.
Right. Think of this document more like a detailed guidance manual. It's the how-to guide for implementing its companion standard, ISO IEC 2001.
Okay. So 2001 is the requirements for a service management system, an SMS.
Yeah, exactly.
And this document, 2002, is the how.
Precisely. It provides the practical guidance, the detailed how and why, to help organizations actually, apply those requirements effectively within their own specific context.
Got it. So it's the practical handbook.
And the source material for this deep dive, it's not some article about the standard. We're working directly from excerpts of the official ISO IE 2002.201.E document itself.
Okay, so we're looking right inside the actual guidance text.
We are. Our mission today, acting like instructors, guiding you through this material, is to walk through this document based only on the text we have available.
Makes sense.
We'll follow its structure, clause by clause, to help you understand its purpose and the key guidance points it offers for implementing a service management system.
Right, we'll break it down to highlight what's most important for grasping service management according to this specific standard, and maybe how it can help you get a handle on that service complexity we talked about.
So let's set the stage just a little bit. This 2019 version we're looking at, it's the third edition of this guidance document.
Okay.
Published in Switzerland, and it's a technical revision of the earlier 2012 version. It's a joint effort, too, coming from both ISO and IEC committees.
Specifically, their Joint Technical Committee, ISO IEC JTC1, Subcommittee SC40, they handle the IT service management and IT governance standards.
Right. So what's new in this edition?
Well, a few key things changed from the 2012 version. The biggest one is probably its alignment with the 2018 version of ISO IEC 20001.
The requirements standard we mentioned.
Exactly. So this guidance is perfectly matched to help you meet those specific 2018 requirements. They also worked on improving consistency in how the guidance is presented.
How so?
They use a really clear structure for each clause and subclause from Clause 4 onwards. We'll get into that.
Okay, that sounds useful.
And they added a new Annex A. It's informative, but it compiles all the mandatory documented information required by 2001.
Ooh, that sounds like gold if you're actually trying to implement this, a checklist of sorts.
Well, they say it's not an audit checklist, but yeah, it's incredibly practical for seeing the types of documents and records the standard expects as evidence of your SMS.
Okay, great. Let's really unpack this document then, starting where it starts. The introduction. This is where it sets the stage for why this guidance even exists.
Right from the get-go. The introduction hammers home the core concept. ISO IE 20000-2 is explicitly guidance for implementing the requirements you find in ISO IE 20001.
So it doesn't add new requirements?
Nope. It just elaborates on how to meet the existing ones. It really is that practical handbook for building your SMS.
And it frames adopting an SMS not just as like an operational task, but as a strategic decision for an organization.
Exactly. It's influenced by the organization's overall objectives, its governing body, all the different parties involved across the whole service lifecycle, not just the tech teams.
And the goal?
The goal, as the document puts it, is achieving services that are both effective, they meet the needs, and resilient. They can handle disruption.
That alignment with business strategy seems key.
It is. And like we said, this guidance is designed to align directly with ISO IS 2000-1.2018.
Now, one point I found really insightful in the introduction was its flexibility.
Yeah, how so?
It's explicitly written to be independent of guidance for managing any specific type of service.
Right. So it applies whether you're talking IT services, cloud, facilities management, whatever.
Exactly. The principles and practices can be applied broadly. Organizations are actually encouraged to combine accepted frameworks, like IDLE or COBIT or whatever, with their own unique experience.
Which makes sense. Service management isn't a rigid one-size-fits-all template. It's a framework you adapt.
Mm-hmm.
The document also notes that while they're not required by the standard, appropriate service management tools can really help support the SMS.
Make things more efficient, like monitoring or reporting.
Exactly. But importantly, it doesn't specify which tools. It's vendor neutral.
It's about the system, the processes, not the specific software.
Precisely.
And the introduction also spells out the benefits you can expect from putting an SMS in place using this guidance. What are the highlights there?
The core benefits listed are achieving ongoing visibility and control over your services, and it's establishing a clear path for continual improvement.
Which leads to better effectiveness, better efficiency.
Right. And that improvement cycle, it applies not just to the services themselves, but also to the service management system, the way you manage things that underpins them.
The introduction also clarifies some key terms, which is always helpful before diving into the details.
Yeah, definitions matter. It defines service, for instance, as specifically referring to the services that are within the defined scope of the SMS.
And that scope is something the organization itself sets, which means the organization, as used in the document, refers to the specific entity or part of an entity within that same scope. So it could be just an IT department, not the whole company.
Exactly. It could be just one part. And that organization is the one managing and delivering services to its customers, often called the service provider.
Right. It's about the boundaries of the management system you're actually building.
And delivered, another key term, clarification. It doesn't just mean the day-to-day operation.
No.
It includes all the activities across the entire service lifecycle. So planning, design, transition, delivery, and improvement. Basically, everything from cradle to grave for the service.
That's a broad scope. Now, a really critical point for how services work today, the involvement of other parties. Outsourcing, shared internal services. The introduction tackles this directly, doesn't it?
It does, and it takes a pretty pragmatic stance, I think.
Yeah.
An organization can still demonstrate conformity to the 20001 requirements, even if other parties are involved.
Other parties meaning external suppliers, internal teams outside the SMS scope, customers even.
All of the above. They could be providing services or components or even running processes for you. The absolute key thing, though, is that the organization retains accountability for meeting the requirements in clauses 6 through 10 of 2001.
Okay, so accountability stays home, even if responsibility for doing the work is shared. How do you prove that accountability?
By demonstrating control over those other parties' contributions. The guidance points specifically to Clause 8.2.3, which is all about controlling those parties.
Examples.
The text mentions needing controls for a party providing infrastructure components, maybe, or a party operating the service desk process for you, including handling incidents. You need mechanisms to manage their contribution and make sure it meets your standards.
But there's a line, right? You can't just outsource everything and slap a 20,000 conformance label on it.
No, definitely not. The document is very clear. An organization cannot claim conformity if other parties provide or operate all the services, service components, or processes within the scope of your SMS. But if they only provide or operate some elements, then conformity is usually still possible as long as you demonstrate that crucial control and retain that overall accountability for clauses 6 to 10.
Makes sense. And the introduction also clarifies what this specific guidance document doesn't cover.
Right. It explicitly states it excludes specifying particular products or tools. It's focused on the management system standard, not on promoting specific vendor solutions.
But it does suggest that understanding 2001 and using this guidance can help you figure out what you need when you do go looking for tools.
Exactly. Knowing what you need to manage helps you choose tools that actually fit your requirements, rather than buying a tool and hoping it solves your problems.
Okay, so that sets the stage pretty well. Why the guidance exists, its scope, who it's for, what it doesn't do. Now, how is this practical guidance actually structured? You mentioned a consistent format from Clause 4 onwards.
Yes, this is really helpful for navigating the document. For every clause or subclause, starting with Clause 4, the guidance is typically laid out in 3 distinct sections.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's a summary of the required activities from ISO AH 20001. It's not the full requirement text itself, just a brief reminder of the activity that clause relates to.
Okay, a quick what needs doing.
Exactly. Then comes the real meat, the explanation section.
This is the how-to.
This is the how-to and the why. It describes the purpose of the clause and provides that detailed practical guidance, examples, recommendations on how to implement the requirements. It might even point you to other relevant standards. This is where you find the real actionable advice.
Got it. And the third section.
Other information. This adds important context. Things like typical roles and responsibilities involved in that area, and crucially, it often specifies the types of documented information records, plans, policies that support implementing the guidance in that specific clause.
So as we go through this, we can think, what's the core activity, required activities, why do it and how, explanation, and who does it and what proof do I need, other information.
That's a great way to think about it. That structure is your navigation key through the guidance.
Okay, let's start our walkthrough then, following the document's table of contents. Clause 2 is normative references. Pretty standard stuff.
Yeah, very standard for these kinds of documents. It just lists other documents that are essential for understanding this one. ISO/IEC 20010, which covers terminology and concepts, is cited here.
Meaning you need the definitions from Part 10 to fully grasp Part 2.
Correct. Which leads nicely into Clause 3, terms and definitions.
Which points you to where to find those definitions.
Exactly. Primarily in ISO/IEC 20010, but also mentions broader databases like the IEC Electropedia and the ISO Online Browsing Platform, just ensuring everyone's speaking the same service management language.
Okay, now we get into the core guidance. Clause 4, context of the organization. This sounds like figuring out where your SMS fits in the bigger picture.
That's precisely it. Subclause 4.1, understanding the organization and its context, is about establishing that environment. What are the internal and external factors that affect your ability to deliver services?
And the guidance says this is a top management job.
Primarily, yes. They might get help from analysts, technical, business. But defining the context starts with leadership, understanding the landscape the SMS operates in.
Then 4.2 is about everyone else who has a stake, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties.
The purpose here is fundamental, really. You need to identify the requirements of everyone who's relevant to your SMS internal groups, external customers, regulators, maybe suppliers, to make sure the SMS actually supports effective service delivery for them.
So interested parties is just another word for stakeholders.
Pretty much anyone who can affect or be affected by your SMS decisions or activities. Understanding their needs is crucial input for everything else you do in setting up the SMS.
Which leads to 4.3, determining the scope of the service management system, defining the boundaries.
Exactly. What's in the SMS, what's out, which services, which locations, which customers, maybe even which specific processes. The guidance is clear. This scope statement must be documented.
Another top management task.
Yes, again, often with expert input. Key inputs for defining the scope include those internal-external issues from 4.1, the stakeholder needs from 4.2, and the specific services you intend to manage. Are you covering one service? A group? All of them? Is it IT, cloud, facilities? That all feeds into the scope definition.
So you understand your environment, who cares, and what exactly you're going to manage. That brings us to 4.4, the service management system itself.
Right. This clause is about the actual work of establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving the SMS. Once you've got the context, parties, and scope agreed, well, now the organization has to decide how it's going to meet the requirements laid out in 2001.
How do you map your reality to the standards clauses?
That's the question. Do you align your existing processes, create new ones? Do you structure things exactly like the standards clauses, or maybe combine or rename processes in a way that makes more sense for your specific organization?
Applying the framework practically.
Exactly. And the guidance stresses that to get ongoing value, you have to keep these processes current, review their performance. Documenting the SMS is required, and it points to Section 7.5 for more on that.
And leadership kicks it off.
Top management provides the initial authority and the basis for setting up the SMS, though responsibility for the detailed work can and usually is delegated.
Okay, that makes sense for setting the scene. Moving into leadership's ongoing role, Clause 5 is all about leadership.
This is critical. It underscores that service management isn't just a bottom-up technical thing. It needs active direction and commitment from the very top.
So 5.1, leadership and commitment.
This highlights that top management is ultimately accountable for the SMS and the services. They need to ensure regular reviews happen, which links forward to Section 9.3 on management reviews. They're responsible for creating the overall service management policy and the high-level objectives.
And making sure those align with the business goals.
Absolutely. They must align with the organization's overall strategic direction. The service management plan, which we'll get to, isn't just a technical doc. Top management directs its development because it describes the strategic intent of the SMS.
They also assign roles and responsibilities.
Yes, they delegate authority and assign responsibility for SMS and service decisions down to the appropriate levels. This is crucial for making sure decisions can actually be made effectively day to day.
What about defining value? That seems important.
Very. Top management defines what constitutes value. That could be internal things like cost reduction or employee satisfaction, or external things like the service outcomes and benefits perceived by customers. They need to connect service management objectives to business outcomes and processes to avoid, silos or conflicting goals. Their authority really provides the foundation for the whole SMS.
Clause 5.2 covers the policy.
Right. Top management establishes the service management policy and makes sure it's communicated. A key element the guidance highlights is that the policy must include a commitment to continual improvement of both the SMS itself and the services it manages.
And it needs to be known internally, available externally.
Yes, communicated internally so everyone understands the direction, and available externally where relevant. The guidance suggests maybe aligning it with other management system policies, like for quality, if you have them, but it must remain clearly relevant to the SMS and services.
And 5.3 is organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities, getting specific about who does what.
Exactly. Top management identifies the roles needed for all aspects of the SMS design, implementation, operation, review, improvement.
Wow.
They assign specific responsibilities and authorities for making decisions related to the SMS and services and for ensuring conformity to the standard.
And clarity is key here.
Absolutely. Clear communication and documentation of these roles, responsibilities, and authorities are essential. Internally, and also to other interested parties like suppliers or customers where needed. You need unambiguous lines of responsibility and accountability for each service and process.
Does the guidance give examples of typical roles?
It does. It mentions things like a process owner responsible for a process's design, adherence, measurement, improvement. A service owner responsible for a specific service across its entire life cycle. A process manager, more focused on the day-to-day operation and resource management for a process.
And people actually doing the work.
Yes, personnel performing procedures. It also mentions the possibility of a management representative role, specifically tasked with reporting on conformance back to top management.
Other examples?
Service desk manager, infrastructure manager, information security officer, service continuity manager. Lots of potential roles depending on the organization structure and the scope of the SMS. The key is that top management assigns the necessary authority, especially to those who need to report back on SMS and service performance.
Okay, so Clause 4 sets the context. Clause 5 gets leadership direction and structure in place. That logically leads us to Clause 6, planning. This is about preparing for the actual operation.
Exactly. Planning is crucial before you dive into doing.
Yeah.
Subclause 6.1 is actions to address risks and opportunities. This is proactive thinking.
Looking ahead for potential problems and potential positives.
Precisely. You identify potential pitfalls and also positive possibilities related to your SMS and services. And the inputs for this, they come directly from understanding your context, 4.1. and your stakeholders' needs, 4.2.
What kind of risks does the guidance mention?
It gives examples like the risk of not fulfilling service requirements, maybe due to natural conditions, supply chain problems, financial issues, or risks specifically related to involving other parties, like outsourcing failures.
And how do you deal with them?
You determine their potential impact and likelihood, then use your organization's risk acceptance criteria, basically, your risk appetite, to decide how to treat them. This isn't a one-off task. It should be done regularly or whenever significant changes happen. Ideally, it aligns with how the organization manages risk overall.
And treating a risk doesn't always mean eliminating it.
Right. The guidance lists different treatment options. Avoidance, like maybe limiting software downloads to avoid malware risks. Considering a risk as an opportunity if it might have positive effects, like gearing up for increased demand. Or reducing the risk, like patching a vulnerability to lower the chance of exploitation.
Any external references here?
It mentions ISO 31000 for general risk management guidance. And in terms of documentation, you might have your overall risk management approach documented and maybe a risk register to track specific risks and actions.
Now, who owns this?
Accountability often sits with top management or their delegates. Sometimes there's a specific risk manager role.
Okay, risk handled. Next is 6.2. Service management objectives and planning to achieve them.
This is about setting clear, measurable targets for your service management efforts. These objectives need to be aligned with the overall business objectives and the service management policy we talked about in Clause 5.
Why? Objectives.
The purpose is really to focus the SMS and the services on meeting specific business needs and service requirements. They need to be documented, measurable, achievable within a certain time frame, and reviewed periodically to make sure they're still relevant.
So these documented objectives become the guiding stars for the SMS.
Pretty much. They are documented, often within the service management plan itself. Top management is accountable for establishing them, and specific roles are assigned for measuring progress towards them and actually achieving them. Relevant parties, personnel, maybe suppliers or customers, should also be identified in relation to these objectives.
And then 6.3 is about planning the service management system as a whole.
Yes, the purpose here is creating, implementing, and maintaining the service management plan. Think of it as the overarching blueprint for your SMS. It reflects the policy, the objectives, the requirements, and describes how your SMS is designed to operate.
Sounds like a central document. What goes into it?
The guidance details typical contents. It includes the scope, which services are covered, any known limitations, like maybe support hours, and importantly, it captures all the obligations that shape the SMS design.
Obligations like
Organizational policies, financial rules, technical standards, other management system standards you might need to align with, like ISO IEC 27001 for security, legal and regulatory requirements, like data protection laws, and contractual obligations, maybe penalties and customer agreements. These obligations are critical inputs, especially for areas like asset management or information security later on. The plan also covers authorities and responsibilities, the resources needed, human, financial, technical, information, how you'll work with other parties, any supporting technology or tools you plan to use, your approach to measurement, auditing, reporting, and improvement, and of course the service management objectives themselves.
And it adapts based on risks.
Yes, the risks and opportunities identified in 6.1 should lead to adjustments in the plan. It also details how you plan to achieve the objectives and requirements and how you'll implement corrective actions if things go off track.
So it really is the master plan.
It is. It needs to be documented, though it might reference other documents. Top management is accountable for making sure it exists and is maintained, but they'll typically delegate the actual development and ongoing review to appropriate personnel.
Okay, so we've framed the SMS in its context, got leadership driving it, and done the strategic planning and risk assessment. Now, how do you actually support the day-to-day operation? That brings us to Clause 7, support of the service management system.
Exactly. This clause covers the fundamental building blocks needed to make the SMS run smoothly. Subclause 7.1 is all about resources.
People, money, tools.
Pretty much. Determining and providing the necessary human, financial, technical, and information resources needed for both the SMS itself and the services it manages. And remember, we said tools aren't required by 2001.
Right.
But the guidance here points out they can significantly boost efficiency and effectiveness. Think monitoring tools, measurement tools, reporting tools.
Are resources documented somewhere?
Yes, they need to be identified, and the guidance suggests they might be documented or referenced in the service management plan from 6.3. Information about human resources, staffing levels, time allocation, and the defined roles and authorities become part of the SMS review cycle.
Who's ultimately responsible for resources?
Overall accountability sits with top management or the governing body throughout the SMS lifecycle. The guidance also notes the risk if roles and authorities are unclear and stresses how important it is to define and communicate what contribution each human resource or role makes.
Makes sense. Now, 7.2 covers competence. Our source material was pretty thin here, just the heading, really.
That's right. But the underlying standard, 2001, does require the organization to determine the necessary competence for personnel affecting SMS performance and ensure they are competent based on education, training, or experience. So the guidance here would elaborate on how to determine those needs and ensure they're met. Things like skills matrices, training plans, etc.
Okay. Next is 7.3, awareness. This isn't quite the same as competence, is it?
No, it's broader. Awareness is about making sure everyone involved, anyone supporting the SMS, understands the service management policy, the objectives, the SMS itself, and the service portfolio. The goal is to help them understand how their individual work contributes to the bigger picture.
How do you promote awareness?
The guidance suggests communication. Communicating how the SMS aligns with objectives and expectations, how the policy, objectives, and plans support delivering value, and making sure people know where to find important information procedures, agreements, reports.
And leadership plays a role here, too.
Absolutely. Communication from top management can be really motivating, helping personnel understand their specific role and how it contributes to achieving objectives and delivering value. The guidance gives examples like celebrating improvement successes, but also urgent communication needed during major incidents or about customer complaints.
Following awareness naturally comes 7.4, communication.
Right. This is about determining what information needs to be communicated internally and externally to support the SMS, achieve objectives, and deliver services effectively. And then, of course, actually communicating it.
Is there planning involved?
Yes, the guidance mentions a communications plan. It might detail how things like SMS alignment, value delivery, and the location of key information are communicated. Again, top management's communication role in motivating people is reiterated here.
What about methods?
All sorts. Face-to-face, electronic, written. The guidance highlights planning for alternate communication channels in case of a major service loss. You still need to be able to communicate. Examples of documented communication info include orientation materials, briefings, reports, emails, social media use, feedback mechanisms. Responsibility for communication is shared, but having designated roles can promote consistency.
Okay, now for a core component of any management system standard, documentation. 7.5 is documented information. This section seemed to have more detail in our source.
It did. It's a crucial area. 7.5.1, the general subclause, lays out the basic requirement. You must produce the documented information required by 20001 and any other documentation the organization determines is necessary for the SMS to be effective.
So, require docs plus whatever else you need.
Exactly. The purpose is to make sure essential information for successful SMS and service operation is acquired or created, kept up to date, and properly controlled. It needs to be reviewed, retrievable when needed, and protected appropriately.
But crucially, not documentation for documentation's sake.
Yeah, it's a key message in the guidance. The focus should be on the value the documented information provides, not creating excessive paperwork. Documented info can include policies, plans, procedures, agreements, specifications, descriptions, reports, records, lots of things.
But it doesn't mean everything needs a detailed procedure.
No, the guidance explicitly clarifies that the standard doesn't require a plan for every single process or exhaustive written procedures for every possible scenario. It's about what's necessary and adds value.
That's a relief for implementers, I bet.
Definitely. The guidance also touches on structuring and managing this information, maybe using naming or numbering systems for version control. Formats can be diverse web pages, paper documents, electronic files, databases, content management systems. It also includes managing relevant external information like standards, regulations, or customer documentation. Templates and tools can help maintain consistency. Approval requirements vary too. Top management might approve objectives, while an incident report might just need logging in a system.
Okay. 7.5.2 covers creating and updating documented information. Again, minimal detail in our source.
Right. This subclause would provide guidance on the processes for actually generating and maintaining the documents. The other information part under this in the source did mention that, while not mandated, keeping records about the documented information itself, descriptions, formats, roles involved can be useful. Roles and authorities for creating and updating info are assigned based on the organization's needs.
Then 7.5.3 is about control of documented information, managing it once it exists.
Exactly. This is about managing and controlling that information throughout its life cycle, from creation to disposal, and making sure it's available and suitable for use when and where it's needed. And, importantly, that it's adequately protected.
Protection from what? Unauthorized access? Loss?
Both. The guidance highlights the risk of unauthorized release of protected information. So your information security policies, from 8.7.3, and any legal, regulatory, or contractual rules about retention periods, protection levels, and disposal methods definitely apply here. Different types of information might need different controls, internal versus external, different security classifications.
Any tools suggested?
It suggests that a content management system, CMS, can help ensure consistency, especially for things like policies, plans, the service catalog, SLAs, contracts. It also mentions linking related information, like if an SLA change impacts related contracts, and potentially using change management, 8.5.1, or even configuration management, 8.2.6, treating key documents as configuration items, and lifecycle management. Yes, control includes periodic review, maybe annually, updating as needed, archiving old versions, and secure disposal when appropriate. It also covers controlling access, distribution, retrieval, use, and protecting it from damage or loss.
There's a specific subclause, 7.5.3.2.1, on control of records. How are they different?
Records are a specific type of documented information that provide evidence of activities performed or results achieved. evidence of conformity to requirements, and evidence that the SMS is operating effectively. They need to be legible, identifiable, and retrievable. Their management, retention, archiving, disposal must align with those legal, regulatory, or contractual obligations. An example given is the review history of a document.
And 7.5.3.3 offers other information for control.
Yeah, it's just useful records might include descriptions of the control methods, formats used, and roles assigned. Roles and authorities for control are based on the organization's needs. Things like specifying retention schedules, destruction methods, storage locations, and who approves destruction can be defined here.
Finally, 7.5.4 lists the service management system documented information.
This is basically a pointer back to the requirements in 2001. It lists some key examples of documented information that the standard requires, like the SMS scope statement, policies, objectives, plans, process and procedure documents needed, and the service catalog. It's a helpful reminder of the core documentation set.
That's a pretty thorough look at documentation. What about knowledge more broadly? 7.6 is knowledge management. Again, not much detail in our source here.
Right, just the headings and a short explanation. The core idea, though, is ensuring necessary knowledge, which is broader than just formal documented information. Though it includes, it is available and managed effectively.
Why is knowledge management important for an SMS?
Well, successful operation, especially in areas like incident and problem management, really depends on having readily available, accurate, relevant, and consistent knowledge. Think about diagnosing issues quickly or finding workarounds.
So it's about getting the right info to the right people at the right time. Staff, users.
Exactly. Knowledge might be needed by internal staff or other parties involved in delivery, but also potentially by customers and users, perhaps enabling self-service, which can improve support efficiency. Tools and document management systems can help establish and share this knowledge. The guidance also stresses writing knowledge in a style appropriate for the intended audience. You wouldn't give highly technical details to an end user for self-service, right?
Makes sense.
And critically, like documented information, knowledge needs to be kept current. The guidance highlights the danger of outdated knowledge, giving the example of an outdated service continuity plan, which could be disastrous. Updating or removing outdated knowledge promptly is vital.
Okay, so Clause 7 lays down all these essential foundations resources, competent and aware staff, effective communication, and well-managed documentation and knowledge. That really sets the stage for the core operational activities covered in Clause 8.
Exactly. Clause 8 is operation of the service management system. This is where the rubber meets the road, where you put the plans into action and actually deliver the services according to the SMS framework. Subclause 8.1 kicks it off with operational planning and control.
Sounds like implementing the plans we made back in Clause 6.
Precisely that. It's about defining, planning, and implementing the various processes needed to meet the requirements of your SMS. You establish performance criteria for these processes based on requirements, and then you control the processes using those criteria.
Examples of criteria.
Things like meeting incident closure targets, ensuring the service catalog is always current and accurate, or maybe completing the annual service continuity plan test. You also need to define and implement controls within these processes that indicate when services or processes aren't meeting requirements. This provides evidence of success or highlights areas needing improvement.
What about changes during operation?
Planned changes to the SMS operation itself need to be controlled. The guidance recommends using the change management process from 8.5.1 based on a change management policy to avoid unintended negative consequences.
And if parts of the operation are outsourced?
If processes or parts of processes are operated by other parties, they must be controlled according to the requirements specified later in 8.2.3, control of parties involved. We need to make sure their performance aligns with our SMS. Documentation here would include records of the planning activities, and progress may be plans, schedules, timelines. Getting customer agreement on planned activities that affect them and documenting the roles and responsibilities of both parties is also mentioned. It also notes that the skills and roles needed for planning and implementation might differ from those needed for day-to-day operation.
Okay, moving deeper into operations, 8.2 is service portfolio. This clause looked quite comprehensive in the source material.
It is. It covers managing the whole collection of services that are within the scope of your SMS. 8.2.1 starts with service delivery.
Which is the point of the whole system, right?
Fundamentally, yes. The requirement is to operate the SMS in a coordinated manner to actually deliver the services. The purpose is coordinating all the resources and activities needed for SMS operation to meet the defined requirements. Coordination happens through things like integrated communication from top management messages down to daily team interactions and integration of information between different parts of the SMS, like configuration data feeding incident management, which might trigger change, which might lead to problem investigation.
A web of connections.
Exactly. And ensuring all activities are focused on achieving the objectives, meeting targets, and delivering value. Documented information here might include procedures for coordination or reports showing measurements against targets. Responsibilities typically fall to roles like a service owner, service manager, or maybe a specific level manager.
Then 8.2.2 is plan the services.
Mm.
Is this different from the overall SMS planning in Clause 6?
Yes, this is more specific to the services within the portfolio. It involves determining and documenting the requirements for each service, understanding its criticality to the business, identifying any duplication or dependencies between services, and prioritizing proposed changes to services, making sure those priorities align with the overall policy and objectives.
So managing the life cycle of individual services within the portfolio.
Right. Understanding service criticality. How important is this service to the organization, to customers, to users? Helps with resource planning and setting appropriate service-level agreements, SLAs. Prioritizing proposals for new services or changes to existing ones needs to consider business needs, strategic alignment, resource availability, and so on.
And documenting the service planning is important.
Yes, the guidance mentions documenting service requirements, criticality, dependencies, and any overlaps. These strategic planning activities need clearly assigned authority. Maybe a service portfolio manager or individual service owners with approval from top management. It reiterates the service owner role having responsibility throughout the service lifecycle, possibly with an operational manager handling the day-to-day specifics.
Now, a really critical section given how interconnected services are today, 8.2.3, control of parties involved in the service lifecycle. We touched on this earlier regarding accountability.
Yes, this is the detailed guidance on how to coordinate activities with those other parties, external suppliers, internal teams, customers acting as suppliers who provide or operate services, components, or processes that are part of your service delivery chain.
How do organizations typically coordinate?
The guidance suggests various methods: using shared tools, having integrated teams, holding joint meetings, using shared information systems like common risk registers or knowledge management systems. The key is having defined ways of working together.
And it clarifies who these other parties might be.
Yes, it gives examples. External suppliers doing things like outsourcing testing, hosting services, or providing application support. Internal suppliers, like maybe HR running the competency process for service staff, or the corporate security team running security controls that impact services. And even customers acting as suppliers, perhaps providing the IT infrastructure in their own building or handling first-line support themselves.
And you can ask these parties to operate specific processes.
Yes, you can. They might use their own documented processes or follow ones defined by your organization. Crucially, your organization needs to maintain a description of the accountabilities and responsibilities in these relationships. It even references an external standard, ISO 37500, which provides guidance on outsourcing, though we don't need to detail that here.
So how do you demonstrate control over these parties?
The guidance focuses on objective measurement, measuring the performance of the processes they operate for you using relevant KPIs, like incident closure targets if they run your service desk, and measuring the effectiveness of the services or components they provide, like whether they meet agreed availability targets.
And you evaluate these measurements.
Yes, the organization evaluates the measurements and defines any necessary improvement or corrective actions. These measurements might come from the organization itself, from the other party, or even from an independent third party. It points forward to Clause 9 for more on evaluation techniques.
Documented agreements are key here, I assume.
Absolutely vital. Documented agreements, like contracts with external suppliers, are key. These agreements should clearly identify the scope of what the party is providing, reference the relevant objectives and targets, and clarify all the accountabilities and responsibilities. Records of the measurements and evaluations need to be kept. And it reiterates that crucial point. The organization remains accountable to its customers for the end-to-end service, even if other parties are responsible for delivering specific parts. The supplier management process in 8.3.4 also applies here.
Okay, that's clear. Next up in the portfolio section is 8.2.4, Service Catalog Management.
Right. The requirement here is to describe the services that are within the scope of your SMS in one or more service catalogs. These catalogs need to be targeted at the relevant audiences, maybe the organization internally, customers, users, other parties like suppliers.
What's the main purpose of the catalog?
to clearly describe the services, improve understanding of what they offer, what the intended outcomes are, and what dependencies exist. It's a really key tool for setting expectations, especially with customers. It needs to be available to everyone who needs access.
Can you have different views, like internal versus external?
Yes, absolutely. The guidance mentions different views are possible. An organization might have one main catalog, or multiple catalogs, maybe one showing all services for internal use, including planned, live, and retired services, and another customer-facing one showing only live and maybe upcoming services. It should also show dependencies, how a business service relies on underpinning technical services or components, which might come from various internal or external suppliers. Supplier information might be included if relevant.
How do you keep it up to date, especially if things change fast?
Good question. The guidance suggests designing it for easy maintenance, maybe using dynamic web content rather than static documents. And any changes to the catalog content should be managed via the change management process, 8.5.1, considering the potential impact of those changes. There should be a defined process or procedures for managing the catalog items, ensuring access control, data integrity, accuracy, and managing the relationships and dependencies within it.
Does 8.2.4.3 give more detail on the catalog content?
Yes, the other information section mentions format flexibility. It could be electronic, part of a tool, etc. It lists typical contents, service name and description, tailored to the audience, service level targets like request fulfillment times, restore times, contact points, hours of service and support, including exceptions, any options like basic versus premium tiers, price, if applicable, the service owner and maybe technical owner, how to request the service, links to supporting contracts, security arrangements, the service components involved, and those dependencies we mentioned.
It gives an example of dependencies.
Yeah, like a user device service might depend on components like specific applications, internet connectivity, and hardware support, possibly all from different suppliers. Services in the catalog can be listed individually or maybe grouped logically. Other documentation mentioned includes procedures for creating and maintaining the catalog and records of inputs-outputs from reviews. Roles involved could include a manager for the overall portfolio, a specific service catalog manager, maybe an information manager for production, and the service owners who provide and maintain the info for their specific services.
Okay, after the catalog, the portfolio section covers 8.2.5, asset management.
Right. The requirement here is to identify the assets needed to deliver the SMS services and manage them according to any relevant obligations, legal, regulatory, contractual, that were identified back in the Service Management Plan, 6.3.
Purpose being
To effectively manage the assets that are necessary to operate the services. The guidance notes that the requirements in 2001 for asset management are quite limited compared to full dedicated asset management standards like ISO 5501. The focus here is specifically on identifying assets needed for service delivery and managing them according to those obligations.
what counts as an asset here?
Examples given include hardware, infrastructure components, equipment, software licenses, even things like real estate or vehicles if they're essential for service delivery. Assets can be owned by different parties, the organization, customers, suppliers. A key example of an obligation is managing software licenses to ensure you don't exceed the maximum allowed users.
And some assets might also be configuration items, CIs.
Exactly. The guidance points out that some assets, like maybe a critical service monitoring application or a server, are also CIs, because changes to them need to be controlled via configuration management, 8.2.6, due to their importance for service delivery.
What does 8.2.5.3 add?
The other information section notes that the results include records of the service assets and their ownership. The obligations they need to be managed against are identified back in the Service Management Plan, 6.3. It mentions that full asset management standards have specific roles that go beyond what 2001 requires. For the SMS context, responsibilities include identifying the service assets, identifying the relevant requirements and obligations for them, and checking conformity periodically.
Okay, that leads smoothly into 8.2.6, configuration management, managing the CIs.
Right. The requirement is to identify, record, control, track, and verify CIs, and manage the relevant configuration information needed for the SMS services. The core purpose is ensuring the accuracy of that configuration information throughout the entire service lifecycle.
Now, a key point here is a configuration management database, CMDB, mandatory.
According to this 2019 guidance based on the 2018 standard, no, a formal CMDB is no longer explicitly mandatory like it arguably was in earlier versions. However, you do need some kind of system or method for documenting, retrieving, and maintaining the configuration information.
So you need the information, but maybe not necessarily in one specific database product.
Correct. The CIs themselves need to be controlled, so their status is known and up to date, and access to the configuration information needs to be controlled to maintain data integrity. CIs change during activities like deployment or release, so the process needs to ensure the configuration information gets updated, maybe supported by discovery tools. Embedding CI updates within the change management process, either automated or manual, is highlighted as good practice.
How do you ensure accuracy?
Regular audits or verification checks are needed to compare the recorded configuration data against the actual live environment. Discrepancies found need to be corrected. And this accurate configuration information needs to be made available to other processes that rely on it, like change management, assessing impact, incident management, identifying affected components, capacity planning, or service continuity planning.
What about 8.2.6.3, other information?
It lists relevant documented information, the definition of CI types, and what information is required for each type, records of changes made to CIs and the results of audits, and reports on those audits, changes, and overall data accuracy. Roles include an authoritative owner for each CI type, responsible for recording maintenance, and personnel involved in updating the information and performing the audits.
Okay, that wraps up the quite detailed 8.2 on the service portfolio. Clause 8.3 moves on to relationship and agreement. This sounds like managing connections outwards.
Exactly. It covers managing the relationships and agreements with both customers and suppliers, and maintaining the agreed service levels. The clause overview apparently mentions a figure 2, which we don't have, that likely illustrates these relationships. The organization connecting with customers via business relationship management, BRM, and service level management, SLM, and connecting with suppliers via supplier management.
And it reminds us of the different supplier types.
Yes, external, internal, and even the customer acting as a supplier. It also notes that subcontracted suppliers used by your suppliers, aren't directly managed by your SMS's supplier management process, though your supplier should be managing them.
Makes sense. So 8.3.2 is business relationship management, BRM, focusing on the customer side.
Yes, the purpose is to establish and maintain good relationships with customers, both internal and external, based on understanding their needs and ensuring their expectations are satisfied. This involves regular reviews of the relationship itself, which might be less frequent than the detailed operational SLM reviews.
What about handling feedback, like complaints?
The guidance requires a mechanism for handling customer complaints. They need to be recorded, analyzed, resolved, including communication and any corrective actions, used as input for improvement, reported on, and formally closed. Complaints that reflect operational issues might trigger incidents or problems. The goal is to assure the customer that action's being taken. There should also be an escalation mechanism for urgent complaints. Handling compliments is also suggested as a way to reinforce success and acknowledge staff efforts.
And customer satisfaction.
This is highlighted as key feedback. Records of customer satisfaction should be gathered regularly, maybe through transaction-based feedback or periodic general surveys. Analyzing this satisfaction feedback is considered a primary input for service improvement, feeding into the continual improvement process, 10.2.
What about documentation and roles for BRM?
Documented information includes the inputs and results from satisfaction surveys and reports on complaints and overall satisfaction levels. Roles could include dedicated customer relationship managers or designated personnel who have this responsibility, with authority delegated from top management. There would also be personnel handling the satisfaction input and those responsible for resolving complaints.
Okay, next is 8.3.3, service level management, SLM. This is about the specifics of service delivery targets.
Exactly. The requirement is to define, agree, record, and manage the levels of service provided. The purpose is to define and document achievable service levels that meet customer needs, agree on them, and then ensure those commitments are actually met.
Who defines the levels?
The organization defines the services and the proposed levels, usually based on customer requirements balanced against the provider's capabilities. The format of the agreement can vary, maybe standard terms for commodity services, or a formal service level agreement, SLA, for more complex or tailored services.
What goes into an SLA?
It should specify the rights and responsibilities of both parties and cover all the relevant service components needed to deliver the end service. It should also include exceptions, situations where the targets might not apply, like during a major service continuity event, or maybe during the initial stabilization period for a brand new service. SLAs should also include workload limits.
Workload limits, why?
To define the scope, the SLA applies to like the number of users, transactions, or components covered. This needs to be monitored because significant changes in workload might mean the SLA needs review, perhaps triggering change management if costs increase due to needing more staff or resources, for instance. The targets themselves should be defined from the customer's perspective, focusing on aspects important to them.
And performance against these targets needs tracking.
Constantly, performance is monitored, reported on, and reviewed regularly with the customer. If targets are missed, the causes need to be analyzed, and the findings should feed into continual improvement. 10.2. Workload also needs monitoring against those agreed limits, potentially impacting demand management 8.4.2, or triggering change management if limits are breached.
What does 8.3.3.3 add?
The other information section lists documented info like the documented services and SLAs themselves and records of workload and performance against targets. Roles include accountable service level managers, possibly service level analysts who handle reporting and monitoring, and technical personnel who perform the monitoring and collaborate with SLM and maybe capacity management.
Then 8.3.4 is supplier management. Back to the other side of the relationship.
Right. The requirement is to manage suppliers external, internal, and customers, acting as suppliers who provide services, components, or processes that contribute to your SMS services. The purpose is managing these relationships effectively to ensure they contribute efficiently to the overall SMS and service delivery. This applies throughout the service lifecycle planning, design, transition, delivery, improvement.
What kind of things might suppliers do?
The guidance gives examples: operating entire services, like an operations center, providing components, hardware applications, operating specific components like managing servers, or even operating specific processes for you, like incident management or reporting. Different approaches might be needed for managing external suppliers versus internal groups or customers acting as suppliers.
Do you need formal agreements even with internal suppliers?
The guidance stresses that a documented agreement is needed even with internal suppliers, as this can often be a risk area if responsibilities aren't clear. It states that effective organizations document agreements with all types of suppliers involved in their service lifecycle.
And supplier targets should align with customer targets.
Ideally, yes. Supplier service level targets should be consistent with or support the targets promised to the end customer in their SLAs. The organization needs to manage the risks associated with using suppliers, including the risk of them breaching their SLAs. This might involve renegotiating supplier targets or working with a supplier on mitigation actions. Interfaces between the organization and suppliers need managing communication channels, relationship management, SLM alignment, coordination if multiple suppliers are involved. You need a clear definition of how combined processes work and who has overall responsibility, potentially using common or interfacing tools.
How often is supplier performance reviewed?
Regularly, based on needs, maybe monthly, quarterly, annually. Evaluation parameters typically include performance against service level targets, adherence to contractual commitments, and potentially considering customer satisfaction or experience related to the supplier's contribution. Issues are analyzed, corrective actions agreed, and improvements managed via continual improvement. 10.2. It references ISO 33500 again here for outsourcing guidance.
What about documentation and roles in 8.3.4.3?
The main documented information is the contract for external suppliers, or the documented agreement for internal customer supplier. External contracts typically include scope, specifications, SLAs aligned with customer targets, other obligations, incentives, penalties, reports, authorities' responsibilities, RSCI models suggested, and other items like charging, reviews, reporting processes, exceptions. Internal agreements might be more or less formal depending on the context. Records of performance measurements need to be kept. Roles include a supplier manager, may be dedicated per supplier, or managing multiple suppliers responsible for the contract, relationship, and performance monitoring. This role needs clear authority and responsibility. Other personnel might be involved in monitoring, analyzing, and reporting performance. It notes that specific supplier manager roles for internal customer as supplier aren't explicitly required, but might exist.
Okay, that covers relationships. Clause 8.4 moves into supply and demand. This sounds like getting into the resource and financial side of things.
It is. It covers budgeting and accounting for services, forecasting and managing demand, and planning and managing capacity to meet that demand. 8.4.1 starts with budgeting and accounting for services.
The requirement is to budget and account for services according to the organization's financial policies.
Yes. The purpose is to support understanding the total cost of providing services, which then enables effective cost management. It helps control the financial aspects of service provision, ongoing operation, funding for new services, changes, or improvements. This is based on understanding the costs associated with individual services or groups of services, the overall cost of provision, and how administrative costs are calculated and potentially allocated.
Any specific principles mentioned?
It briefly mentions principles like income representing an exchange medium, which could be actual money or just internal accounting entries, and management needing to produce evidence of financial control. You need to define criteria for how budgeting and accounting will be done, maybe per service group, per customer package, to ensure you have relevant monitoring and visibility. Cost reports can allow comparison with market costs or internal targets.
What does 8.4.1.3 add?
Other information gives examples of documented info. The process procedures for budgeting accounting, historical draft actual budgets, service management forecasts, covering workload, capacity needs, unit costs, revenue, expenditure, the budget timetable, and financial reports, comparing cost revenue against budget, explaining variances. Roles include a budgeting accounting manager and managers accountable for specific service or departmental budgets.
Okay, finance covered. Next is 8.4.2, demand management, forecasting the need.
Exactly. The requirement is to forecast and analyze demand for services and monitor actual service consumption against available capacity. The purpose is to understand current and future demand patterns so that capacity can be adjusted effectively.
How do you measure demand?
You use the service requirements from the Service Catalog, 8.2.4, and SLAs, 8.3.3, which define performance targets and workload limits to determine appropriate units for measuring demand and consumption. This could be things like number of users, bandwidth used, storage consumed. You then monitor changes in demand compared to expected levels.
And it links to capacity.
Directly. Demand management cooperates closely with capacity management, 8.4.3. If consumption deviates significantly from forecasts or threatens capacity limits, they work together to agree on necessary changes. Forecasting demand is also a key input for the budgeting accounting process, 8.4.1, and for capacity planning, 8.4.3.
What about 8.4.2.3?
Other information lists documented info like demand forecasts and consumption reports. It notes that roles involved can vary significantly depending on the organization.
Which leads us straight into 8.4.3, capacity management, meeting the demand.
Right. The requirement is to determine, document, and provide the necessary human, technical, information, and financial resources to meet the current and future capacity requirements for services. The purpose is ensuring sufficient capacity resources are available when needed.
It covers different types of capacity?
Yes, the guidance mentions managing capacity in various areas: human resources, technical infrastructure, information systems, financial resources. It notes that human and financial capacity planning often happens outside the direct scope of service management, for example, in HR or finance departments, but it needs to link with the resource management in 7.1. Capacity management includes planning based on current actual demand and future forecast demand, from 8.4.2.
At what level is capacity managed?
It can be managed at the level of individual CIs, groups of CIs, or at the end-to-end service level. Requirements for capacity are determined and documented. The guidance points out that while 2001 doesn't explicitly require a documented capacity plan, planning activities are essential.
What does capacity planning consider?
Key aspects include understanding the demand levels and patterns from demand management and ensuring capacity is aligned with agreed targets from SLAs, availability requirements, 8.7.1, performance needs, and service continuity requirements, 8.7.2. Changes to capacity should ideally be made in a timely manner before performance thresholds are breached to avoid impacting service quality. Sufficient capacity means meeting requirements.
And it's monitored.
Yes. Continuous monitoring of capacity usage, trend analysis, and taking remedial action when necessary are key activities. If capacity issues cause service problems, like slow performance due to lack of resources, these should be investigated via incident and problem management, 8.6.1, 8.6.3, and any underlying issues leading to capacity shortfalls should feed into continual improvement, 10.2.
What does 8.4.3.3 add?
Other information lists documented info, such as capacity requirements, plans, forecasts, results of trending or modeling, and potentially security policies related to capacity, based on SL targets and demand. Forecasts and reports are produced and analyzed. Records are kept of changes made to capacity based on these reports or changing demand patterns. Roles include assigning authority to make capacity changes and personnel responsible for monitoring and reporting on current and forecast capacity.
Okay, that covers the Supply and Demand Balancing Act. Clause 8.5 moves into service design, build, and transition. This is about bringing new or changed services online, right?
Exactly. This is where the planning for new services or significant changes from 8.2.2 and Clause 6 gets turned into reality and introduced into the live environment. 8.5.1 starts with the critical process, change management.
Managing changes to prevent chaos.
Pretty much. The requirement is to manage all changes throughout the service lifecycle using a defined process. The purpose is to manage changes effectively and efficiently, ensuring the integrity of services and the SMS itself, preventing disruption, and making sure changes align with business objectives.
What kind of changes does it cover?
It's broad. Changes to services, underlying components, processes, or even documented information like policies or plans if the change is significant. Changes are typically triggered by requests for change, RFCs.
Where do RFCs come from?
All sorts of places. Problem management, finding a root cause that needs fixing, continual improvement initiatives, direct requests from customers or staff, findings from audits, legal or regulatory changes forcing an update, or opportunities presented by new technology. All RFCs need to be recorded.
And they're handled differently based on type.
Yes, categorization helps manage the flow. Common categories are standard changes, pre-approved, low risk. Normal changes need full assessment and authorization, and emergency changes need expedited handling. The category influences the level of assessment and who needs to authorize it. The guidance also mentions that automated changes are possible, but the policy needs specific provisions covering the approval process and verification steps for those. The overall change management policy defines what types of changes must go through this formal process. Apparently, there's a figure 3, not provided in our source, that illustrates how change management interacts with many other processes. The explanation section goes into more detail on the process flow. Interested parties, users, suppliers, internal staff affected by a change need to be identified and informed about planned changes that affect them, and they might provide input into the assessment. RCs need to be prioritized based on criteria defined by the organization.
What kind of criteria?
Things like the risks of implementing versus the financial impact, the expected business benefits, feasibility, does it conflict with policies or require a policy change, the impact on existing services, and the coordination needed with other changes or parties. Changes then undergo assessment.
Assessing what?
Impact, risks, resources required, dependencies, timing, testing needs, acceptance criteria, intended outcomes, and the effect on the SMS itself, other services, or other parties. The results of this assessment need to be documented and reported. Then comes authorization.
Who authorizes changes?
A designated change authority. The specific roles involved might vary depending on the type and risk of the change. Once authorized, the change is planned for build, testing, and implementation. Build involves assembling the components or configuring the service. Testing verifies that the change meets the requirements, aligns with the documented design, and satisfies the acceptance criteria. The extent of testing needs planning, but the guidance acknowledges that no testing can be exhaustive.
What about rollback plans?
Yes, a plan for rolling back or backing out the change needs to be designed and documented in case significant issues arise after implementation. An example is having a plan to revert to a previous application version or hardware component. If configuration items, CIs, are affected by the change, the configuration information and related documented info must be updated, linking back to configuration management 8.2.6.
And then deployment.
Built-in tested changes then proceed to release and deployment, covered in 8.5.3, for activation into the live environment, assuming final approval from change management. After implementation, there should be a post-implementation evaluation to compare the actual results against what was expected. If issues occurred, remediation actions need to be agreed upon and carried out with relevant parties. Finally, change records should be analyzed for trends, success rates, types of changes requested with learnings feeding back into continual improvement, 10.2.
What does 8.5.1.3 add for other information?
It lists key documented information. The change management policy, which needs to be approved and available, documented procedures, especially for different change categories, the RFCs themselves, which should identify affected CIs, provide rationale, state the impact if not made, include schedule or resource cost estimates, records of the assessment and authorization steps, a change schedule projecting authorized changes, records of the implemented changes and their effectiveness evaluation, and records of any rollbacks or remediation actions taken. Roles include the change authority, personnel performing assessment, scheduling, implementation, build test, and evaluation.
Okay, change management is sorted. Next is 8.5.2, service design and transition. This sounds like the project management part of getting a service live.
In a way, yes. The requirement is to plan, design, build, and transition services based on agreed requirements. The purpose is to ensure that new services, changes to existing services, service removals, or transfers of services, ignorable to or from another party, meet the requirements, are actually deliverable and manageable and can be provided at the agreed cost and quality levels. This process applies from the initial concept or request through to the service becoming operational, being removed, or being transferred. It covers the planning, design, build, and transition activities, which are typically triggered and governed by approvals from change management. 8.5.1.
The guidance breaks this down further, starting with 8.5.2.2.1 on planning.
Yes. This involves identifying all the planning considerations before making the change live. This planning often refines and evolves concurrently as the design progresses. Key planning activities include determining who has authority and responsibility for the design, build, and transition phases, defining the specific activities, timelines, and milestones, identifying the resources needed, human, technical, information, financial, analyzing dependencies on other services or relationships, identifying testing requirements, covering in the most significant uses, ensuring budget consistency with the required effort, documenting the service acceptance criteria from the perspective of the customer, the organization, and maybe other stakeholders. Performing risk management specifically for the design and transition, determining the intended outcomes, which should be measurable, and assessing the impact on the SMS itself, other services, and other parties.
Communication is part of planning, too.
Yes, planning includes communicating with relevant parties, like suppliers involved in the change, and keeping top management informed. Any CIs affected by the planned new service or change need to be controlled via configuration management. 8.2.6.
Then 8.5.2.2.2 covers the design phase.
Right. The output of this phase is typically a documented service design package that reflects the agreed service requirements. Activities here include identifying any new or changed resource requirements and their impact, identifying who will have authority and responsibility for the operation and delivery of the service once it's live, internal teams, external parties, identifying needs for staff education, training, or new skills, updating the service catalog via 8.2.4 to reflect the new or changed service, describing any necessary changes to measurement systems, linking to 9.1, determining the impact on other services and performing risk management to reduce negative impacts, identifying any new or changed needs for SLAs, contracts, or other agreements, internal, customer, third party, and updating other relevant parts of the SMS, like policies, processes, procedures, measures, or knowledge bases.
And after design comes 8.5.2.2.3, build and transition, putting it all together.
Exactly. This follows the planning and design phases. Build involves assembling the service components and the service itself. Testing is then performed to demonstrate that the requirements are met, that it aligns with the documented design, and that the acceptance criteria are satisfied. Testing should ideally be done before implementation into the live environment. If an old service is being removed as part of the change, testing should verify that any remaining dependencies still function correctly.
What if acceptance criteria aren't met?
Then actions need to be agreed upon. Maybe deferring the implementation, correcting the issues, or perhaps proceeding with implementation, but with an agreed list of post-implementation fixes. Test results need analyzing and might lead to modifications in the planning or design if necessary. Activation into the live environment happens after change management approval, using the release and deployment process, 8.5.3. After deployment, relevant parties need to be informed about the outcome, success or failure, any impacts, and next steps. Finally, there should be verification that the intended outcomes of the service change have been achieved, which might take some time.
What does 8.5.2.3 add under other information?
It mentions that planning activities should be documented, maybe a formal plan, schedules, timelines, RACI charts, task lists. The service design needs to be documented, showing how requirements are fulfilled, describing CIs, supporting systems, operational details, and perhaps preliminary SLAs. The design phase results in new or changed SLAs, contracts, and agreements. Implementation leads to changes in the service catalog, managed via 8.2.4. Any new services or changes that affect the overall SMS need to be reflected in the service management plan, policies, plans, procedures, measures, and knowledge base. Reports should be provided to interested parties on the achievement against the intended outcomes.
Okay, that covers design and transition. Finally, for this section, 8.5.3 is release and deployment management, getting the built change into production.
Precisely. The requirement is to plan, test, deploy, and review the success or failure of releases, coordinating closely with change management. The purpose is to ensure that the deployment of new or changed services or components into the live environment is planned and controlled effectively to meet requirements.
What exactly is a release here?
It deals with releases of services, components, or CIs. It has a very close relationship with change management, 8.5.1, and service design transition, 8.5.2. The guidance defines a release as a new or updated version of a service, component, or CI, which can contain multiple individual changes bundled together.
Are there different types of releases?
Yes. The guidance mentions different types might be defined based on frequency or management method. Things like normal releases, emergency fixes, maybe selective or phased rollouts. Management could be manual or automated. Releases need to be built and tested before deployment, potentially in separate staging or test environments. The deployment methods themselves need to be planned and managed. Risk assessment specifically for the release and deployment activities should be done.
What about planning for failure?
Yes, backout or recovery plans need to be developed and ideally tested in case the deployment fails. Having a rollback capability, the ability to easily revert to the previous stable state, is mentioned as good practice, if feasible, as it preserves the original state and system integrity. Any CIs affected by the release need to be baselined using configuration management, 8.2.6, before the deployment.
How is success tracked?
The success or failure of each deployment needs to be monitored, measured, and analyzed to identify opportunities for improving the deployment methods themselves. This includes tracking incidents that occur shortly after a release. Results should feed into continual improvement, 10.2. Immediate feedback on the outcome should go back to change management, incident management, especially if the release fails and causes issues, and other relevant parties.
What's in 8.5.3.3, other information?
For complex deployments, it suggests documenting a detailed release plan covering activities, the deployment date, authorized by change management, deliverables, documentation, software components, methods, automated, manual, acceptance criteria, how success will be demonstrated, the schedule including any go-no-go decision points, back-out recovery procedures, and contingency planning. Example, if the service will be unavailable during the release. For routine releases, procedure documents might be embedded in tools or logs. Records include CI baselines before release, analysis of success rates over time, and any resulting improvement plans. If a release resolves specific problems or known errors, this should be referenced in the records. Roles include the authority to approve releases, which might vary by release category, personnel performing the deployment, personnel verifying success and effectiveness, and personnel monitoring and analyzing overall success rates.
Right, that covers getting things changed and deployed. Clause 8.6 then deals with resolution and fulfillment. This is about handling things that go wrong and handling standard user requests.
Exactly. This is where the SMS interacts directly with users facing issues or needing standard services. 8.6.1 is incident management.
The requirement is managing the resolution of unplanned events that disrupt service. Managing incidents from recording to closure, including a special procedure for major incidents.
Yes, and the purpose is clear. Restore affected services as quickly as possible within agreed targets to minimize the negative impact on the business and users. Identified incidents need to be recorded and classified, considering urgency, impact, nature of the incident, service type, user type. They should be correlated with the affected services, components, or CIs involved.
Why link-related incidents?
It helps determine the extent of an issue and can help identify underlying problems or potential workarounds. The guidance makes an important distinction. An incident, a service disruption, is not the same as an SMS nonconformity, failure to meet a requirement, although the underlying cause of an incident might be a nonconformity, like if a required process wasn't followed correctly.
What about getting incidents resolved? Escalation.
Yes, escalation procedures functional to specialist teams or hierarchical to management should be used to ensure timely resolution. Criteria for what constitutes a major incident need to be determined, maybe something affecting all customers or having a major security impact. Specific procedures for handling these major incidents are required.
What do major incident procedures cover?
Things like prioritizing their resolution above all else, activating workarounds quickly, communicating status updates effectively, especially to affected customers, and escalating awareness to top management. Once resolved, major incidents should be reported on, reviewed, and analyzed to capture lessons learned, which feeds into continual improvement. Chem.2. All actions taken during incident management need to be recorded for analysis and potential audit. Key aspects to record include duration of unavailability or degradation, affected SLAs or CIs, any linked RFCs or service requests, and associated problems.
What's in 8.6.1.3, other information?
It states that a documented procedure is required for major incidents, but optional for other incident types, though documenting procedures or work instructions for all incidents is often useful. Incident records are typically created and managed using a service management tool. Roles include assigning responsibility for handling different classes of incidents to specific personnel or teams. Top management needs to be informed about major incidents. Specific responsibilities and authorities should be defined for major incident managers, like the authority to escalate, coordinate resources, communicate widely, and guide personnel. Dedicated personnel solely for major incidents might exist in some organizations.
Okay, that's incidents. Next is 8.6.2, service request management, handling standard user needs.
Exactly. The requirement is to record, prioritize, fulfill, update, and close service requests. The purpose is simply to manage the fulfillment of these standard requests effectively. They need to be recorded and classified by nature, urgency, service type, user type.
Examples of service requests.
Things like password resets, requests for information, or maybe pre-approved low-risk changes like moving a piece of equipment. They're prioritized based on their classification. They should be correlated to the services they affect. SLAs might be associated with certain request types, defined in SLM 8.3.3, or other metrics like target response times might be defined. Requests are either fulfilled or denied. Fulfillment should be verified with the requester, and then the request is closed. The transition from fulfillment to closure needs to be defined. Automation can often be used here. All actions need recording. Users might be able to see the progress of their requests. Self-service options and automation possibilities should be documented.
What about 8.6.2.3, other information?
It mentions documented actions might exist in procedures or work instructions for personnel, e.g., or work instruction for fulfilling a pre-approved change, or guidance for handling information requests. But work instructions aren't necessarily required for every single type of request. Records need documenting, classification, fulfillment details, affected CIs. Statistics should be gathered for reporting, trend analysis, and identifying improvement actions. A service request menu, often part of the service catalog, 8.2.4 or a web portal, is useful for users. Automated tools are possible. Roles involve the personnel who actually fulfill the requests according to the defined procedures.
And rounding out the section, 8.6.3 is problem management, getting to the root cause of incidents.
Precisely. The requirement is to identify problems, often through trend analysis of incident data or other sources, determine their underlying root causes, and define actions to prevent the occurrence or recurrence of related incidents. It notes that problems relating to the SMS itself, like a process not being followed, are handled as nonconformities under 10.1.
What's the main purpose of problem management?
To minimize service disruption by proactively identifying and analyzing the causes of incidents and then taking action to prevent them, reduce their impact, or permanently resolve the underlying problem. Problems need to be identified, recorded, classified, and prioritized, considering urgency, impact, nature, service type. They can be identified from recurring incidents, trend analysis, or reviews. Problems are assigned to personnel with the appropriate skills to investigate. Senior management involvement might be needed to secure resources for investigation or resolution. Known errors problems where the root cause is known but a permanent fix isn't yet available are usually identified and documented here, though they could arise from other processes too.
Are there targets for resolving problems?
SLAs might include targets for problem resolution. Problems need to be managed and resolved within agreed timescales, with progress updates provided to relevant parties. Implementing the resolution, the permanent fix typically follows the change management policy and process, 8.5.1. When considering resolution options, details like risks, costs, and resource needs are required. Problem records should be linked with related incident records, change records, and CI records, and kept updated throughout the process.
How do you know if the fix worked?
The effectiveness of the resolution needs monitoring and review, perhaps through a post-implementation review as part of the change process. Personnel monitor and report on ongoing effectiveness. If a root cause simply can't be identified, or if eliminating it is impossible or impractical, then action should be planned to at least reduce the effects or frequency of related incidents, for example, implementing better workarounds. Information on root causes, known errors, and effective resolutions or workarounds needs to be recorded in a system accessible to relevant parties, like incident management staff, to help them handle future occurrences more efficiently. Data on resolution effectiveness should be recorded and analyzed, with improvement activities feeding into continual improvement. 10.2.
What's in 8.6.3 other information?
Documented information includes records of problems, known errors, root causes, workarounds, and resolutions. Metrics and data about the problem management process itself should be gathered and documented for continual improvement, looking at potential actions. identifying resource needs, setting realistic targets, improving communication. Roles involve personnel assigned to analyze problems, determine causes, and record all the relevant information, resolutions, workarounds, known errors.
Okay, that covers resolution and fulfillment. The final section in Clause 8 is 8.7 Service Assurance. This sounds like building confidence through reliability, continuity, and security.
Exactly. These processes focus on ensuring services are dependable and protected. 8.7.1 is Service Availability Management.
The requirement involves analyzing risks to availability, agreeing and documenting requirements, monitoring availability, and investigating unplanned unavailability.
Yes, the purpose is to manage and maintain service availability at the levels agreed with the business and customers. Availability requirements, including specific targets, need to be documented, often SLAs or other agreements, and must consider any legal, regulatory, or contractual obligations. Planned availability should be designed to match these requirements.
What happens when things go unexpectedly offline?
Unplanned unavailability events need to be recorded and investigated to identify the cause, restore service, linking to incident management, and take action to prevent recurrence, linking to problem management. Investigation results should be shared with incident, problem, and change management processes. Service availability needs to be monitored against the agreed targets. Data and trends are recorded, compared to targets, and action is taken if issues arise or trends look problematic. Monitoring can be continuous or periodic. Availability management works closely with capacity management, 8.4.3. If lack of capacity threatens availability, requests for more resources are made. And it works with service continuity management, 8.7.2. Major or unacceptable unavailability might trigger the invocation of continuity plans.
What's in 8.7.1.3 other information?
Documented information includes the availability requirements and targets, records of availability achieved, especially unplanned unavailability, and analysis reports on unplanned unavailability, causes, impacts, recovery actions. Roles include assigning authority to agree on service level targets for availability, personnel responsible for monitoring availability, comparing performance to targets, and working with continual improvement.
Next, 8.7.2, Service Continuity Management, planning for the big disasters.
Essentially, yes. The requirement is to analyze the risks of major service loss, plan for recovery, test those plans against requirements, and invoke them if needed. The purpose is to ensure the required level of service availability can be restored after a major disruption within agreed timescales. This should align with the organization's overall business continuity management framework if one exists.
How are risks analyzed here?
Risks of major service loss are analyzed using the principles from risk management, 6.1. Assessed and treated to meet the agreed availability requirements during such events. The response to an actual major loss includes invoking the service continuity plans. The explanation section continues, stating the organization needs to produce and maintain one or more service continuity plans that meet the requirements and targets defined in SLAs or other agreements. Key elements of these plans include procedures for invoking the plan, what are the criteria, who has authority, who needs to be involved or informed, procedures to follow during the major loss event. These might include disaster recovery plans for specific systems, plans for physical moves, failover procedures, restoration measures, the targets for availability while the plan is invoked, how quickly can it be activated, how long should restoration take, the recovery requirements, does the service need full availability immediately or partial and for how long, and procedures for returning to normal operations once the crisis is over, including rollback if needed, and associated targets.
And these plans need testing.
Absolutely. Plans must be tested regularly to verify that the procedures actually work, that personnel know their roles in the procedures, that the necessary systems, infrastructure, facilities, and documentation meet the requirements, and that the target recovery times can be met. Test results need documenting and analyzing, with findings feeding into continual improvement, 10.2. The plans also need regular review and updating, especially when there are changes in the organization, services, or identified risks.
What does 8.7.2.3 add?
Other information emphasizes that continuity depends on knowledgeable and responsible managers and personnel. Alternate personnel should be identified in case key people are unavailable. Responsibilities for invoking the plan need to be crystal clear. Roles should be assigned for conducting testing activities and measuring the effectiveness of the tests and the plans themselves.
And the last part of service assurance, 8.7.3, is information security management, protecting the data.
And the systems and services themselves. The requirement is to define a relevant information security policy, considering obligations from planning, 6.3, assess security risks, agree on and implement necessary controls, and manage and report on information security incidents. The purpose is to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the classic CIA triad, of information that's relevant to the SMS and the services it manages.
What kind of scope does this cover? Physical? Logical?
Both. The guidance mentions physical controls, like door entry systems, locks, technical controls, like antivirus software, firewalls,
Right.
access control systems, identity management, and human controls, like enforcing strong passwords, having clear rules for information handling, providing security awareness training.
How are security requirements determined?
Based on the value of the information, any specific obligations, the results of risk assessment, and legal, regulatory, or contractual needs. Security risks are assessed using the risk management principles from 6.1. Controls are then agreed upon based on the assessment results and documented. Policies, procedures, and work instructions are needed for security activities. Staff training and awareness, linking back to 7.2 competence and 7.3 awareness, are crucial. The information security policy itself needs to be created, approved, and communicated, outlining its aim and relevance. It references ISO IEC 27001 as the main standard in this area.
And 8.7.3.3 specifically addresses information security incidents. Are they handled differently from service incidents?
Sometimes. The guidance notes that the same tools and procedures as service incidents, 8.6.1, might be used, but security incidents are sometimes managed separately due to confidentiality requirements or higher urgency. Incidents identified as security-related need to be recorded and classified as such for reporting, analysis, and improvement. Reclassification might be needed if an incident was initially logged differently. Priority should be assigned based on impact and risk. Security incidents should be linked if they are a part of a larger service incident. They are escalated, resolved, and closed, similar to service incidents. Security incidents need analyzing to identify improvements. For example, if you see a large number of a particular type of security incident, it might indicate an unaddressed risk.
What about documented info and roles for security?
Documented information includes the approved and communicated information security policy, the documented security requirements, security risk assessment reports, the agreed security controls, any necessary procedures or work instructions, and records of security incidents, including cause, impact, actions taken, lessons learned. Roles include top management being accountable for the overall policy and strategy and responsible for ensuring security risks and controls are managed. Specific roles are assigned for security activities like risk assessment, control definition, and monitoring. Roles are also needed for handling security incidents, gathering data, and determining improvements.
Wow, Clause 8 really is the beast, isn't it? Operational planning, portfolio management, relationships, supply and demand, design-build transition, resolution fulfillment, and service assurance. It covers the entire engine room of service management.
It absolutely does. It details how the SMS framework guides the actual delivery and support of services. But once it's running, how do you know if it's all working effectively? That brings us to Clause 9, performance evaluation.
Checking the results. Makes sense. 9.1 is monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation.
Right. The requirement is to monitor, measure, analyze, and evaluate the performance and effectiveness of both the SMS itself and the services it manages. The purpose is to provide reliable information on that performance and effectiveness.
How do you know what to measure?
Criteria need to be established for evaluating the effectiveness and efficiency of the SMS, its processes, the services, and even key components. The results of these measurements need to be reported and used as key inputs for management reviews, 9.3, internal audits, 9.2, and identifying opportunities for improvement, 10.2. The guidance references an external standard, ISACA 15939, specifically for software and systems measurement processes, but the core idea is defining what to measure and how.
And measurements should relate back to the objectives set earlier.
Yes, critically. Measurements should be related to the service management objectives and targets, from 6.2, to identify any deviations or areas where performance isn't meeting expectations, highlighting potential areas for improvement. Documented information here includes the reports and evidence of the measurements and analyses performed, including conclusions drawn and recommendations for improvements. Roles involve personnel assigned responsibility for monitoring and measuring, possibly assisted by specialists in areas like capacity or security measurement.
Okay, measurement covered. Next is 9.2, internal audit, checking compliance.
Yes, and effectiveness. The requirement is to conduct internal audits at planned intervals to assess whether the SMS conforms to the requirements of ISO IS 20001 and the organization's own defined requirements for its SMS. The purpose is to provide objective information on whether the SMS is operating as planned and meeting the standard.
How are audits managed?
An internal audit program needs to be set up. Audits should be scheduled regularly and also potentially triggered when significant changes occur within the SMS. The audit program should consider things like changes to the SMS itself, policy, objectives, process importance, organizational changes, restructures, growth, new services or locations, shifting priorities, and changes related to key customers or suppliers.
Who performs the audits?
Qualified personnel who are independent of the area being audited, they shouldn't audit their own work. The criteria and scope for each audit need to be documented and communicated to participants beforehand. Audit results must be documented and reported to top management and other relevant managers so that appropriate corrective actions can be taken. Findings and actions from previous audits should also be considered when planning new audits.
What's in 9.2.3 other information?
Documented information includes the defined audit methodologies and schedules, and the audit reports themselves, detailing aspects audited, findings, and any recommended actions. Roles include top management ensuring audits are conducted, and specific roles assigned for planning, conducting, and reporting on the audits.
Okay, audits check conformity. Clause 9.3 is management review. This sounds like top management looking at the big picture.
Exactly. The requirement is for top management to conduct reviews of the SMS at planned intervals. The purpose is to ensure the SMS remains suitable for the organization's needs, adequate in terms of resources and processes, effective in achieving its objectives, and aligned with the overall strategic direction of the organization.
How often?
The standard doesn't specify a minimum interval. It depends on the organization's needs. It might be less frequent than audits, perhaps quarterly or annually is common. The review must cover specific inputs listed in the standard.
What kind of inputs does top management review?
The guidance, reflecting the standard, lists quite a few. The overall performance of the SMS against its policy, plan, and objectives. The performance of the services against their requirements and targets, performance indicators, results from internal and external audits, including the status of nonconformities and corrective actions, a review of continual improvement activities and their alignment with business objectives, results from post-implementation reviews of significant changes, customer satisfaction levels and feedback trends, the performance of external parties involved in service delivery, identified risks and opportunities and the effectiveness of actions taken, the adequacy of resources allocated to the SMS, and the status of actions from previous management reviews.
And the output?
The results of the management review need to be documented. This includes any decisions made and actions required related to improvement needs, changes needed in resources, or potential changes to the service management policy, objectives, or targets.
And the last part, performance evaluation, 9.4, is service reporting, communicating the results.
Yes. The requirement is to report on the performance and effectiveness of the SMS and the services. The purpose is providing relevant, timely information to support decision-making and to communicate service achievements, performance levels, and the value being delivered.
Where does the report data come from?
It's based on the monitoring and measurement data collected under 9.1. The guidance emphasizes that effective reports should be appropriate for their intended audience, accurate and easy to understand, suggesting things like charts can help. Specific reports required by 20,001 are detailed within the relevant process clauses we've discussed. The organization can create a summary or inventory of all the reports it plans to produce.
Different reports for different audiences.
Definitely. Requirements for reporting to customers need to be agreed upon, often specified in SLAs or contracts. Public consumers might appreciate information on trends or plan changes. Governance reports need to be agreed with the governing body or top management. And various internal reports are needed for operational management. An example given of a decision based on reports is instigating improvement actions if service levels aren't being met.
What's in 9.4.3, other information?
Documented information includes the service reports themselves, internal, customer, other parties, which need to be communicated appropriately. These reports can serve as evidence of performance and contribute to the knowledge base, 7.6. A summary of reports to be produced could include details like the report identity, its purpose, frequency, intended audience, data sources, and who is responsible for producing it. Roles involve personnel who produce and distribute reports, and those who determine the content, format, style, and frequency appropriate for each audience.
Okay, so Clause 9 is all about measurement, checking through audits, reviewing by management, and reporting the findings. This seems to lead naturally right into the final clause, Clause 10, improvement.
It's the essential final step in the cycle, taking action to make things better based on all that evaluation. 10.1 deals with nonconformity and corrective action.
This is for when things go wrong with the system itself.
Exactly. The requirement is to evaluate any nonconformity identified and take appropriate action to correct it, including removing the causes and correcting any negative consequences. The purpose is to analyze and take action when these nonconformities affect the performance of the SMS.
What exactly is a nonconformity here?
It's defined as the non-fulfillment of a requirement. These can be identified through various means: internal audits, management reviews, customer feedback. Examples include failure to fulfill a specific requirement from ISO/IA 20001, or failure to meet the organization's own defined requirements for its SMS, or failure to comply with relevant legal, regulatory, or contractual needs.
And it's different from an incident.
Yes. The guidance clarifies again. A service failure is typically handled as an incident, 8.6.1. However, the underlying cause of that incident might be an SMS nonconformity, for example, if a required process wasn't followed, leading to the service failure. SMS nonconformities need to be recorded and their causes analyzed. Corrective action is then taken to control the immediate impact, reduce the likelihood of occurrence, and manage the consequences, like remediating any negative impact on services or customers. Actions should be prioritized, have due dates agreed, and be tracked to completion. The outcome needs review to ensure the nonconformity has actually been addressed effectively.
What's in 10.1.3, other information?
Documented information includes records showing the nonconformity is identified, the actions taken, and the results of those actions. This might be tracked in a continual improvement register. Roles involve various personnel who might be involved in remediation or managing consequences. Ultimately, top management is accountable for ensuring SMS nonconformities are treated appropriately.
Okay, that handles fixing problems with the system. And finally, 10.2 is continual improvement, the ongoing effort.
Exactly. The requirement is to continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of both the SMS and the services it manages, ultimately to maintain and enhance value for the customer and the organization. The purpose is clear. Maintain value through ongoing improvement efforts. This applies to the services themselves, the processes used to manage them, and the overall SMS framework.
How are improvements identified and managed?
Opportunities for improvement need to be identified, evaluated, prioritized, approved, planned, implemented, and their effectiveness measured. Improvement targets can relate to various aspects: quality, efficiency, financial benefits, delivering more value, reducing risks, etc.
Where do ideas for improvement come from?
The guidance lists many potential sources: results from audits and management reviews, analysis of nonconformities, customer and supplier feedback, performance reports, service levels, customer satisfaction, incidents, problems, analysis of metrics, opportunities from technological advancements or automation, findings from risk management activities. Identified opportunities need prioritizing, planning, and implementation based on their potential impact and alignment with business outcomes. The SMS itself might need revising based on implemented improvements, and the effectiveness of improvements needs evaluating against the intended targets and reported on.
What's in 10.2.3, other information?
It suggests that improvement activities can be supported by maintaining a continual improvement register, maybe a simple spreadsheet or a database for collecting, prioritizing, and tracking improvement initiatives. Roles involve top management ensuring the overall improvement process is effective, and various personnel identifying, evaluating, implementing, and measuring specific improvements.
So that covers all 10 main clauses of the guidance, taking us right through the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle for service management, from understanding the context and planning, through operating the services, evaluating performance, and driving improvement. But you mentioned Annex A earlier, the list of documented information.
Yes, Annex A. It's important to remember it's informative, meaning it's guidance, not requirements itself. But it's incredibly useful because it provides a single, consolidated list of all the mandatory documented information required by the actual requirements standard, ISO/IEC 2 ITAUs 1.2012.
So if you're implementing 2001, this annex in Part 2 gives you a handy checklist of all the documents and records you absolutely must have evidence for.
It functions like that, yes. It reiterates that this documented information can be in any suitable format: electronic, paper, integrated into a tool. The documents can be renamed, combined, or split up to suit the organization. And having additional documented information beyond this list is perfectly fine if the organization finds it necessary.
But it's not technically an audit checklist?
Correct. The annex explicitly states it is not an audit checklist, it's not a guarantee of audit success, and it's not guidance on the content of the documents. It simply lists what documented information is required by the standard.
Got it. It's the what list for mandatory documentation. Looking at the examples listed in the outline: policies, plans, records of changes, incidents, problems, customer feedback, service-specific info like the catalogs, CIs, SLAs, capacity requirements, design docs, reports. It really does cover the full spectrum we've discussed. It drives home that a well-managed SMS relies heavily on having accessible, accurate information documented.
It really does. It confirms that documentation isn't just bureaucratic overhead. It's the tangible evidence of your system and the core communication mechanism that makes the SMS work effectively.
And finally, the document includes a bibliography, just listing related standards.
Pretty much. It lists other relevant ISO and IEC standard and guidance documents like ISO 9001 for quality management, ISO 31000 for risk management, ISO EC 27001 for information security, ISO 37500 for outsourcing, and of course ISO 20001 itself. It just helps place this specific guidance within the broader ecosystem of international management system standards.
Okay, so we've really walked through the structure and the key guidance areas of ISO IE 20000 2.201E based on the text provided to us. We've seen how it guides organizations in establishing and managing a service management system, addressing everything from understanding their context and leadership's role through planning, support, all those operational processes, performance evaluation, and finally, improvement.
And following this guidance, as we've seen, is designed to help organizations systematically improve how effective and efficient their services are. It aims to provide that much-needed visibility and control over services and the system delivering them. It's all geared towards achieving continual improvement and ultimately creating and maintaining value for both customers and the organization itself through structured, resilient service management.
Absolutely. So for you listening, maybe think about how these structured areas, understanding context, planning for risks, defining roles clearly, managing information, controlling changes carefully, handling incidents and requests smoothly, ensuring availability and security, evaluating performance honestly, and always looking for ways to improve. How do these apply to services you interact with every day? Or maybe even services you manage, perhaps informally. How much structure and documentation do your services really need to be effective and reliable?
Yeah, and maybe to leave you with one final thought, considering the sheer level of detail we've seen in this guidance document, what's just one area of service management? Maybe something as seemingly simple as handling user requests or just making sure the right information is easy to find was one area in your world that you think could benefit most from applying just a little bit more structure or maybe some better documentation based on what we've discussed.
Great question. Definitely something to ponder. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into ISO IE's 2000 2.20 time E.
It was quite a journey through a dense document, but hopefully walking through it clause by clause like this, kind of like instructors guiding you through the material, has made it much clearer how this guidance can genuinely help organizations tame some of that service complexity we started with.
We certainly hope so. We'll be back soon with another deep dive.